What is going on? Welcome back to King Pilled. I was just talking to you guys just a few minutes ago. If you're tuning in to this for the first time, I did a stream of the Astrolabe this morning where we talked about a bunch of good stuff. And took a quick little break, and I am now thoroughly nicotinized, among other things, and ready to rock and roll again. On this episode, we are going to be doing a live reading of this notorious piece that dropped in February of 2021, 2 weeks after Joe Biden's inauguration. And it was called The Secret History of the Shadow Campaign That Saved the 2020 Election. This is where we got the phrase election fortification from. If you've wondered, if you've heard people use that, if you've maybe used it yourself, but you don't remember where it came from, election fortification. It came from this piece that we're going to read today. So this is normally I do the live streams in the morning every Monday through Friday. The Astrolabe, which is a variety show. We talk funny stuff, entertaining stuff, interesting stuff, keep up with the news, et cetera, et cetera. And that is a YouTube and an X stream only. It's not able to go to X right now because I lost my verification status when I adopted the Dark Mega profile picture. You change your profile picture, your profile name, and it demonetizes or it verifies you for a short period of time. So I am not able to stream there right now, but otherwise that's where the Astrolabe normally would be. This is going to be a part of the King Pilled show. So this one is going to show up on the podcast feeds. So if you're not able to finish it here, and maybe you don't normally watch on YouTube or something like that, then this one will be available in audio format on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, what have you. Which reminds me, if you do listen to the audio version of the King Pilled show, then do me a favor. Even if you don't, if you just want to do me a solid, go over to your podcast platform of choice and go leave us a rating and review. Give us a 5-star rating if you think it's worth it, and give us a review and tell us how awesome and amazing we are. And I just realized that in the time that I was gone, my cat came back in here. So I may have to get up here in a minute and let her out. For now, she's just chilling. I have a plastic bag sitting on the ground down here. And if she sees a plastic bag on the ground, that she has to go lay down on it, which is very odd. She's a strange cat. Nephilim in the chat says, Kamala ad when opened. So much for targeted marketing. Yeah, they are really pressing the Kamala thing right now, which to me I think is it's an indication of desperation. Shout out to Ajablon or Ajablon in the chat. I see you just joined the King Pill Discord. I got the notification, so welcome. Good to have you. And if you would like to join the King Pill Discord and join Ajablon or Ajablon or however you pronounce it, then there's a bunch of good people in there. Got a little over 100 now. Lots of good conversations going on, and that's where we're going to have the Schizo stream tonight, Friday night. Every Friday night about 8 p.m. Central, we talk. We do a Schizo stream, a live stream where we just sit around, we find some interesting schizo rabbit hole to go down, and we watch a video and comment on it. So tonight, it's going to be we're going to be talking about teleportation and it being real, particularly with respect to the Malaysian MH370 flight that disappeared about 10 years or so ago. We're going to watch something on that, and we're also going to be watching, I think, something related to giants existing in America. There was the Kandahar giant that supposedly the U.S. military stumbled upon. We're going to watch something related to that. So if you'd like to be a part of it, then as Duffhead says in the chat, stop being poor, join the Discord. You can go to kingpill.com. Whatever subscription tier you sign up for, you will get access to the Schizo stream tonight. So strongly recommend you go do that. I would say it's the best private community on the internet. It's become that's where all of my closest friends, all the people that I spend the most time talking to, they're all in that Discord. So if you wanna join a good group of people, that's the place for you. All right. So first of all, I posted this thread here this morning after I listened to the Old Glory Club stream last night, talking about the tech bros, the Elon Musk phenomenon, the guys who are making their angle for the crown right now, and the corollary to that being stop fucking blackpilling. We're going to say this until you guys get tired of hearing it. I don't care. You got to stop fucking blackpilling. And this is not simply just a moral case for not blackpilling. Despair is probably the single worst mindset you could allow yourself to spend in. It is a sin to despair. But beyond just the moral aspect of it, there's a pragmatic basis for not blackpilling. And so I wrote a thread today basically laying that out. And now here we go. The cat's going to be a dick. So let me go let her out real quick, and I'll be right back. Out. Go. Okay. So let's share the screen and run through this thread here real quick. So I started off quote tweeting a tweet from a friend of the show, Academic Agent. Martyrmaid tweeted, Kamala has no chance to win a straight election, and the regime knows it will be dangerous to rig it again. But if they pull it off, MAGA will fragment and melt away, and Trump will be just another William Jennings Bryan. So they might decide it's worth the risk to try it anyway. And Academic Agent said, in 2020, there was no Elon Musk, etc. behind Trump. Now there is. I think the second steal is impossible. Regime required all engines go in lockstep on that. Doubt they could pull it off now. So as a jumping off point from that, this is what I wrote. I said, in January of 2021, the regime still commanded vastly more of the narrative than it does today. At the moment that tensions were highest, there was a staring contest among all the various factions in play as each member weighed the consequences of saying, hold on, wait a second, we need to look a little closer at this, versus simply following the course of history. Then they suddenly all fell into place, instinctually following what they perceived to be the most powerful, stable player in the game. And I've described this before as everyone kind of walked up to the precipice and they stood there and then they started looking at each other and who's going to step first. And then they just sort of all instinctually aligned behind the same option. That cost a tremendous amount of political capital, and the regime has spent the intervening 4 years just spending political capital like a drunken sailor. It stopped generating new political capital years ago. So part of that everyone choosing to fall into lockstep behind the regime perspective was this is a move that was made that it was a big show of trust. It was a big show of trust and belief in the regime as still fundamentally competent, not thoroughly perverted and corrupted. That this is still the place to be. So it cost a tremendous amount of political capital. People invested heavily into the regime. That was a big buy. Every attempt to rally the troops has just spurred more defection from their ranks. Can you think of any core regime initiative that has grown more popular over the past 4 years? So here's a bunch of them that just came to mind in the stream of consciousness as I was writing this. COVID just disappeared. Weird. And is widely seen as a clusterfuck of incompetence, corruption, and open malevolence. Even vax injuries are becoming more normal to discuss. Ukraine war is openly talked about as an utter disaster. Israel war has reset various regime factions into a circular firing squad. Economy feels like it's never recovered from COVID. It obviously hasn't. DEI and ESG is being openly rejected. Pride Month was muted. The gap between cost and reliability of infrastructure and utilities has widened, which seems to be accelerating. So it's not just that it's widened, it's that it's widened and that widening seems to be accelerating. Where the cost and the reliability of these different infrastructure things is departing. They're getting more and more expensive and less reliable. As examples, you've got Boeing, Baltimore, CrowdStrike, East Palestine, AT&T hacks, among others. Interest rates are high, and Trump's rhetorically calling for low rates, and most people want low rates. I don't know that they'll actually get low rates. They may. I can see a way where it does and way where it doesn't. But we've also talked about Tom Luongo and Phil Gibson and Daniel DiMartino Booth and their thesis about the role of the Fed right now and the direction that Jerome Powell and Jamie Dimon want to go with it. The Biden debacle has gone catastrophic. Harris is wildly unpopular, both within the regime and without. Trump's near miss was insane regime incompetence and the best, for them, telling of it. The cumulative load of all these failed initiatives has driven major players within the regime coalition into defection to Trump, most notably major tech, Bitcoin, and Wall Street figures. The courts have even subtly signaled an awareness of what's happening and their displeasure with it. Even a number of legacy press rags have notably moderated their tone toward the right, from hair-on-fire hysteria to concerned clucking. Elon's purchase of Twitter has completely transformed the narrative and thrown the regime into a reactive posture. J13 was their chance to get back into the driver's seat, and it failed in perhaps the most epic fashion imaginable. People subconsciously defer to power when they're forced to make instinctive decisions at the height of a crisis. Remember how in late December 2020, the entire machine settled into the same course nearly overnight. Suddenly, the conversation was just over and we were moving forward with Joe. That was possible because a plurality of influential people still operated under the presumption that the regime was fundamentally stable and able to enforce its will. Yeah, it kind of lost its mind over Trump, but he was a serious curveball, and maybe everyone had learned their lesson and we could get back to business as usual. But the opposite has happened. The only reason they were able to paper over the cracks and press forward in 2021 was because they could coordinate forces enough to plausibly sell the idea it was legitimate. Suggesting coordinated voter fraud was beyond the pale. No decent person would do such a thing. When the only people talking about the fraud were those easily cast as fringe weirdos, Giuliani, Byrne, Powell, Jones, etc., it was easy to apply sufficient social pressure to encourage people back into the fold. You're not an election denier, are you? Are you a COVID denier too? A, gasp, anti-vaxxer? I bet you ate Jews too. These accusations held a ton of weight in 2021. Since then, the underlying questions have nearly all been mainstreamed and the stakes are much higher now. Furthermore, in 2021, it was much easier for people to sell themselves on the idea that Trump was a single-term anomaly, a corrective event that had lasted as long as it could, and that it was time to get back to stability and normalcy. Of course, this was silly. And in the 4 years hence, it's become obviously silly. Regardless of what actually happened in 2020 and 2021, at least half the country believes the election was stolen. They openly bragged about it because they can't help themselves. And this is what we're going to read here in just a minute. They're onboarding to the notion that the regime has permanently fractured. It's employed every imaginable means of eliminating Trump and has failed in ever more creatively dramatic ways. Each time, it's amplified his appeal. Power is up for grabs. Blood is in the water. This time around, if the late-night vote dumps start coming in, if a plethora of bizarre electoral anomalies start breaking against Trump, when they try to rob the same bank twice, as the old Glory Club boys said on the stream last night, it won't just be niche corners of the internet and fringe weirdos calling foul. The fucking face of the global town square will be raising hell. 3 of the most popular podcasts in the country will be at DEF CON 1. At least 2 of the most powerful governors in the country will be firing off heaters. And I put this here. This is July 7th. Axios, scoop, House Democratic leadership is bringing out the big guns against a Republican bill set to be voted on next week that would require proof of U.S. citizenship to vote in federal elections, Axios has learned. And Tim Pool says, what? Why? Who disagrees with this? And Elon says, because they want to cheat. And then here's the list of the most popular podcasts per Spotify. Tucker Carlson has overtaken Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan's been the most popular podcast on the planet for years. And Tucker Carlson has now overtaken him. You've also got, at number 5 is the Dan Bongino Show. And then you've got Call Her Daddy with Alex Cooper, canceled with whoever Tana Mongeau is, and Hot Mess with Alex Earl, and then Pod Save America. So this is the American populace in a nutshell. And then you've also got, I got a screenshot from DeSantis. After pushing Biden out, it was predictable that corporate media would provide hundreds of millions of dollars worth of glowing coverage to his replacement. They're trying to do that with Kamala, but it won't work. She's too vacuous, too liberal, and too unaccomplished for the voters to buy the manufactured narrative. This got 1.1 million views. So this sort of narrative, these guys serve as vectors for directing and guiding the narrative. Each of them plays their own little part. But what I'm pointing at here is that there's a whole bunch of different vectors now for this narrative to be pushed forward that didn't exist in 2020. And then I put Greg Abbott's his statement in January about the border wall, when he issued this statement that had very revolutionary language in it, really pushing back on the legitimacy and the credibility of the federal government. So these are all guys that will all be on the same side of this at by the time November, December, January rolls around, and these are all going to be vectors for this narrative being pushed and maintained and sustained, which is ultimately what it will come down to. The political outcome will follow the narrative outcome. And our goal is to ensure that that narrative is blasted so overwhelmingly loudly from so many different corners of the internet that they can't help but take it into consideration. They can't help but push everything to the courts, and the courts can't help but take a very serious look at it. And most importantly, an immensely influential cabal of commercial bankers, investors, and CEOs will be highly displeased. But here's the thing, and here's where you, Anon, play a role. The regime is retarded, or clever, or brazen enough to try it again. It'll be their only play, and it'll be for all the marbles. This is why they must demoralize us. This is why you must stop fucking blackpilling. When you say, hell, when you even believe they're just going to steal it again, you are manifesting that reality. You are facilitating the steal. The only way they can do it is if sufficient public opinion acquiesces to the steal. Black pillars are running cover for them. Whether or not they can steal the election will depend upon a showdown between their collective willpower and ours. We have vastly more potential social force behind us this time, but that will be worthless if we all cuck out. So gather yourself by the balls, banish the thoughts of doom, and press the advantage. Of course, they're mounting the biggest demoralization campaign of all time. They're in an existential fight for power. If you let them demoralize you, you're a bitch. You deserve them. And relatedly, the seems to be the king of the feds at this point. Unpopular opinion, but I don't like seeing Trump golf. In 2016, he would never be caught on a golf course or even wearing anything other than a navy suit and red tie. He deliberately projected an image of himself as all about the business. I don't like this new defanged approach. This is fucking gay. And I loved Pine Barren's response. He says, it's not your movement, it's mine. Parents and small business owners, how many kids do you have? How many people do you employ? We like seeing him eagle against Bryson DeChambeau, and we're building the future of America, not you. Hear, hear. All right. So, there's also this, I saw people passing this around. It would have been more exciting if this was a newer headline, but this was March 7 of 2020. Eric Prince recruits ex-spies to help infiltrate liberal groups. Based. Mr. Prince, a contractor close to the Trump administration, contacted veteran spies for operations by Project Veritas, the conservative group known for conducting stings on news organizations and other groups. Eric Prince, the security contractor with close ties to the Trump administration, has in recent years helped recruit former American and British spies for secretive intelligence gathering operations that included infiltrating Democratic congressional campaigns, labor organizations, and other groups considered hostile to the Trump agenda, according to interviews and documents. One of the former spies, an ex-MI6 officer named Richard Seddon, helped run a 2017 operation to copy files and record conversations in a Michigan office of the American Federation of Teachers, one of the largest teachers' unions in the nation. Mr. Seddon directed an undercover operative to secretly tape the union's local leaders and try to gather information that could be made public to damage the organization, documents show. Using a different alias the next year, the same undercover operative infiltrated the congressional campaign of Abigail Spanberger, then a former CIA officer who went on to win an important House seat in Virginia as a Democrat. The campaign discovered the operative and fired her. Both operations were run by Project Veritas, a conservative group that has gained attention using hidden cameras and microphones for sting operations on news organizations, Democratic politicians, and liberal advocacy groups. Mr. Seddon's role in the teachers' union operation, detailed in internal Project Veritas emails that have emerged between the discovery process of a court battle between the group and the union, has not previously been reported, nor has Mr. Prince's role in recruiting Mr. Seddon for the group's activities. Both Project Veritas and Mr. Prince have ties to President Trump's aides and family. Whether any Trump administration officials or advisors to the president were involved in the operations, even tacitly, is unclear. But the effort is a glimpse of a vigorous private campaign to try to undermine political groups or individuals perceived to be in opposition to Mr. Trump's agenda. Based. Mr. Prince, the former head of Blackwater Worldwide and the brother of Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, has at times served as an informal advisor to Trump administration officials. He worked with the former National Security Advisor Michael T. Flynn during the presidential transition. In 2017, he met with White House and Pentagon officials to pitch a plan to privatize the Afghan war using contractors in lieu of American troops. Jim Mattis, then the defense secretary, rejected the idea. Mr. Prince appears to have become interested in using former spies to train Project Veritas operatives in espionage tactics sometime during the 2016 presidential campaign. Reaching out to several intelligence veterans and occasionally using Mr. Seddon to make the pitch, Mr. Prince said he wanted the Project Veritas employees to learn skills like how to recruit sources and how to conduct clandestine recordings, among other surveillance techniques. James O'Keefe, the head of Project Veritas, declined to answer detailed questions about Mr. Prince, Mr. Seddon, and other topics, but he called his group a proud independent news organization that is involved in dozens of investigations. He said that numerous sources were coming to the group, quote, providing confidential documents, insights into internal processes, and wearing hidden cameras to expose corruption and misconduct. No one tells Project Veritas who or what to investigate, he said. A spokesman for Mr. Prince declined to comment. Emails to Mr. Seddon went unanswered. Mr. Prince is under investigation by the Justice Department over whether he lied to a congressional committee examining Russian interference in the 2016 election and for possible violations of American export laws. This is this investigation is one in a long line of things that has radicalized Eric Prince. Last year, the House Intelligence Committee made a criminal referral to the Justice Department about Mr. Prince, saying he lied about the circumstances of his meeting with a Russian banker in the Seychelles in January 2017. Once a small operation running on a shoestring budget, Project Veritas in recent years has had a surge in donations from both private donors and conservative foundations. According to its latest publicly available tax filing, Project Veritas received $8.6 million in contributions and grants in 2018. Mr. O'Keefe earned about $387,000. And so on. You guys kind of get the point. But I want to get to this other article, make sure that I have time to get through all of it. But this is what Eric Prince was up to 4 years ago, 4+ years ago. And it's interesting seeing how much the what am I trying to say here? The effectiveness of James O'Keefe's operations has increased since then. He's actually gotten some pretty good scoops. The most notable of which probably is the one that we talked about last week, or maybe it was earlier this week. I don't remember. Of him getting the gay cybersecurity professional going deep undercover as he wears his glasses and nobody knows who he is, Clark Kent style. But yeah, so let's get started reading on this. Colin says, nice blue background. Yeah, I knew you'd appreciate that. Josh Ham says, if Dems are spending money on sending ads to me with YouTube knowing my search and video history, then that's good. It means they're incompetent in using data effectively and wasting money. Right. We're going to see here, as we read through this, the way that they've directed their money, the way that they have operated in the past. You got to understand, if you want to out-operate them, you have to understand how they're operating, which is part of why I wanted to revisit this. So let's read it. The secret history of the shadow campaign that saved the 2020 election. A weird thing happened right after the November 3 election. Nothing. The nation was braced for chaos. Liberal groups had vowed to take to the streets, planning hundreds of protests across the country. Right-wing militias were girding for battle. In a poll before Election Day, 75% of Americans voiced concern about violence. Instead, an eerie quiet descended. As President Trump refused to concede, the response was not mass action, but crickets. When media organizations called the race for Joe Biden on November 7th, jubilation broke out instead as people thronged cities across the U.S. to celebrate the democratic process that resulted in Trump's ouster. A second odd thing happened amid Trump's attempts to reverse the result. Corporate America turned on him. Hundreds of major business leaders, many of whom had backed Trump's candidacy and supported his policies, called on him to concede. To the president, something felt amiss. It was all very, very strange, Trump said on December 2. Within days after the election, we witnessed an orchestrated effort to anoint the winner, even while many key states were still being counted. In a way, Trump was right. There was a conspiracy unfolding behind the scenes, one that both curtailed the protests and coordinated the resistance from CEOs. Both surprises were the result of an informal alliance between left-wing activists and business titans. The pact was formalized in a terse, little-noticed joint statement of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and AFL-CIO published on Election Day. Both sides would come to see it as a sort of implicit bargain, inspired by the summer's massive, sometimes destructive racial justice protests, in which the forces of labor came together with the forces of capital to keep the peace and oppose Trump's assault on democracy. The handshake between business and labor was just one component of a vast cross-partisan campaign to protect the election, an extraordinary shadow effort dedicated not to winning the vote, but to ensuring it would be free and fair, credible and uncorrupted. For more than a year, a loosely organized coalition of operatives scrambled to shore up America's institutions as they came under simultaneous attack from a remorseless pandemic and an autocratically inclined president. Though much of this activity took place on the left, it was separate from the Biden campaign and crossed ideological lines, with crucial contributions by nonpartisan and conservative actors. The scenario the shadow campaigners were desperate to stop was not a Trump victory. It was an election so calamitous that no result could be discerned at all, a failure of the central act of democratic self-governance that has been a hallmark of America since its founding. Their work touched every aspect of the election. They got states to change voting systems and laws and helped secure hundreds of millions in public and private funding. They fended off voter suppression lawsuits, recruited armies of poll workers, and got millions of people to vote by mail for the first time. They successfully pressured social media companies to take a harder line against disinformation and use data-driven strategies to fight viral smears. They executed national public awareness campaigns that helped Americans understand how the vote count would unfold over days or weeks, preventing Trump's conspiracy theories and false claims of victory from getting more traction. After Election Day, they monitored every pressure point to ensure that Trump could not overturn the result. Quote, "The untold story of the election is the thousands of people of both parties who accomplished the triumph of American democracy at its very foundation," close quote, says Norm Eisen, a prominent lawyer and former Obama administration official who recruited Republicans and Democrats to the board of the Voter Protection Program. The euphemisms throughout this paragraph are staggering. Absolutely staggering. For Trump and his allies were running their own campaign to spoil the election. The president spent months insisting that mail ballots were a Democratic plot and the election would be rigged. His henchmen at the state level sought to block their use, while his lawyers brought dozens of spurious suits to make it more difficult to vote, an intensification of the GOP's legacy of suppressive tactics. Before the election, Trump plotted to block a legitimate vote count. And he spent the months following November 3 trying to steal the election he'd lost with lawsuits and conspiracy theories, pressure on state and local officials, and finally summoning his army of supporters to the January 6th rally that ended in deadly violence at the Capitol. Isn't it fascinating that he plotted to block a legitimate vote count by demanding a legitimate vote count? The democracy campaigners watched with alarm. Democracy campaigners, that's great. Every week, we felt like we were in a struggle to try to pull off this election without the country going through a real dangerous moment of unraveling, says former GOP Representative Zach Wamp. What a name. Womp Womp. A Trump supporter who helped coordinate a bipartisan election protection council. We can look back and say this thing went pretty well, but it was not at all clear in September and October that that was going to be the case. This is the inside story of the conspiracy to save the 2020 election, based on access to the group's inner workings, never-before-seen documents, and interviews with dozens of those involved from across the political spectrum. It is the story of an unprecedented, creative, and determined campaign, whose success also reveals how close the nation came to disaster. Every attempt to interfere with the proper outcome of the election was defeated, says Ian Bassin, co-founder of Protect Democracy, a nonpartisan rule of law advocacy group. Quote, "But it's massively important for the country to understand that it didn't happen accidentally. The system didn't work magically. Democracy is not self-executing." That's why the participants want the secret history of the 2020 election told, even though it sounds like a paranoid fever dream. A well-funded cabal of powerful people ranging across industries and ideologies, working together behind the scenes to influence perceptions, change rules and laws, steer media coverage, and control the flow of information. They were not rigging the election, they were fortifying it. And they believe the public needs to understand the system's fragility in order to ensure that democracy in America endures. And thus was born the term election fortification. The architect. Sometime in the fall of 2019, Mike Podorzer became convinced the election was headed for disaster and determined to protect it. This was not his usual purview. For nearly a quarter century, Podorzer, senior advisor to the president of the AFL-CIO, the nation's largest union federation, has marshaled the latest tactics and data to help its favored candidates win elections. Unassuming and professorial, he isn't the sort of hair-gelled political strategist who shows up on cable news. Among Democratic insiders, he's known as the wizard behind some of the biggest advances in political technology in recent decades. A group of liberal strategists he brought together in the early 2000s led to the creation of the Analyst Institute, a secretive firm that applies scientific methods to political campaigns. He was also involved in the founding of Catalyst, the flagship progressive data company. These are, if you guys are listening along here, these are important companies to go look into. Go look at the people associated with them. Look at their history. Look at their methods and techniques. Look at what they're up to lately. Have they been folded in and something replaced them? I haven't looked it up yet because this is part of the reason why I wanted to read through this, is to look more closely at the mechanisms that were used to ensure the last election result, because that's a pretty good place to start when looking to combat a similar sort of phenomenon. The endless chatter in Washington about political strategy, Podorzer believes, has little to do with how change really gets made. Quote, "My basic take on politics is that it's all pretty obvious if you don't overthink it or swallow the prevailing frameworks whole," he once wrote. After that, just relentlessly identify your assumptions and challenge them. Close quote. Podorzer applies that approach to everything. When he coached his now adult son's Little League team in the DC suburbs, he trained the boys not to swing at most pitches, a tactic that infuriated both their and their opponents' parents, but won the team a series of championships. Trump's election in 2016, credited in part to his unusual strength among the sort of blue-collar white voters who once dominated the AFL-CIO, prompted Podorzer. Trump's election in 2016, credited in part to his unusual strength among the sort of blue-collar white voters who once dominated the AFL-CIO, prompted Podorzer to question his assumptions about voter behavior. He began circulating weekly number-crunching memos to a small circle of allies and hosting strategy sessions in D.C. But when he began to worry about the election itself, he didn't want to seem paranoid. It was only after months of research that he introduced his concerns in his newsletter in October of 2019. The usual tools of data analytics and polling would not be sufficient in a situation where the president himself was trying to disrupt the election, he wrote. Most of our planning takes us through Election Day, he noted. But we are not prepared for the two most likely outcomes: Trump losing and refusing to concede, and Trump winning the Electoral College despite losing the popular vote by corrupting the voting process in key states. Quote, we desperately need to systematically red team this election so that we can anticipate and plan for the worst we know will be coming our way. It turned out Podorzer wasn't the only one thinking in these terms. He began to hear from others eager to join forces. The Fight Back Table, a coalition of resistance organizations, had begun scenario planning around the potential for a contested election, gathering liberal activists at the local and national level into what they called the Democracy Defense Coalition. Voting rights and civil rights organizations were raising alarms. A group of former elected officials was researching emergency powers they feared Trump might exploit. Protect Democracy was assembling a bipartisan election crisis task force. Quote, it turned out that once you said it out loud, people agreed, Podorzer says, and it started building momentum. He spent months pondering scenarios and talking to experts. It wasn't hard to find liberals who saw Trump as a dangerous dictator, but Podorzer was careful to steer clear of hysteria. What he wanted to know was not how American democracy was dying, but how it might be kept alive. The chief difference between the U.S. and countries that lost their grip on democracy, he concluded, was that America's decentralized election system couldn't be rigged in one fell swoop. That presented an opportunity to shore it up. The Alliance. On March 3, Podorzer drafted a 3-page confidential memo titled Threats to the 2020 Election. Quote, Trump has made it clear that this will not be a fair election and that he will reject anything but his own re-election as fake and rigged, he wrote. On November 3, should the media report otherwise, he will use the right-wing information system to establish his narrative and incite his supporters to protest. End quote. The memo laid out 4 categories of challenges: attacks on voters, attacks on election administration, attacks on Trump's political opponents, and, quote, efforts to reverse the results of the election. Then COVID-19 erupted at the height of the primary election season. What a coincidence. Normal methods of voting were no longer safe for voters or the most elderly volunteers who normally staff polling places. But political disagreements, intensified by Trump's crusade against mail voting, prevented some states from making it easier to vote absentee and for jurisdictions to count those votes in a timely manner. Chaos ensued. Ohio shut down in-person voting for its primary, leading to minuscule turnout. A poll worker shortage in Milwaukee, where Wisconsin's heavily Democratic black population is concentrated, left just 5 open polling places, down from 182. In New York, vote counting took more than a month. Suddenly, the potential for a November meltdown was obvious. In his apartment in the D.C. suburbs, Podorzer began working from his laptop at his kitchen table, holding back-to-back Zoom meetings for hours a day with his network of contacts across the progressive universe. The labor movement, the institutional left like Planned Parenthood and Greenpeace, resistance groups like Indivisible and Move On, progressive data geeks and strategists, representatives of donors and foundations, state-level grassroots organizers, racial justice activists, and others. They're literally just describing the regime right here. That's the regime. In April, Podorzer began hosting a weekly 2.5-hour Zoom. It was structured around a series of rapid-fire 5-minute presentations on everything from which ads were working to messaging to legal strategy. The invitation-only gathering soon attracted hundreds, creating a rare shared base of knowledge for the fractious progressive movement. Quote, at the risk of talking trash about the left, there's not a lot of good information sharing, says Anat Shanker-Osorio, a close Podorzer friend whose poll-tested messaging guidance shaped the group's approach. There's a lot of not invented here syndrome, where people won't consider a good idea if they didn't come up with it. The meetings became the galactic center for a constellation of operatives across the left who shared overlapping goals but didn't usually work in concert. The group had no name, no leaders, and no hierarchy, but it kept the disparate actors in sync. Quote, Pod played a critical behind-the-scenes role in keeping different pieces of the movement infrastructure in communication and aligned, says Maurice Mitchell, National Director of the Working Families Party. You have the litigation space, the organizing space, the political people just focused on the W, and their strategies aren't always aligned. He allowed this ecosystem to work together. Protecting the election would require an effort of unprecedented scale. As 2020 progressed, it stretched to Congress, Silicon Valley, and the nation's state houses. It drew energy from the summer's racial justice protests, many of whose leaders were a key part of the Liberal Alliance. And eventually it reached across the aisle into the world of Trump-skeptical Republicans appalled by his attacks on democracy. Got 55 watching and 25 likes on YouTube. Do me a favor and share the show and hit the like button. Get some more people in here tracking this. Because I think this is a... what can I say here? I think there's a lot to learn from. We'll say it that way. Securing the vote. The first task was overhauling America's bulky election infrastructure in the middle of a pandemic. For the thousands of local, mostly nonpartisan officials who administer elections, the most urgent need was money. They needed protective equipment like masks, gloves, and hand sanitizer. They needed to pay for postcards letting people know they could vote absentee, or in some states, to mail ballots to every voter. They needed additional staff and scanners to process ballots. In March, activists appealed to Congress to steer COVID relief money to election administration. They're so fucking brazen. Led by the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, more than 150 organizations signed a letter to every member of Congress seeking $2 billion in election funding. It was somewhat successful. The CARES Act, passed later that month, contained $400 million in grants to state election administrators. But the next tranche of relief funding didn't add to that number. It wasn't going to be enough. Private philanthropy stepped into the breach. An assortment of foundations contributed tens of millions of dollars in election administration funding. The Chan Zuckerberg Initiative chipped in $300 million. Quote, it was a failure at the federal level that 2,500 local election officials were forced to apply for philanthropic grants to fill their needs, says Amber McReynolds, a former Denver election official who heads the nonpartisan National Vote at Home Institute. McReynolds' two-year organization became a clearinghouse for a nation struggling to adapt. The Institute gave secretaries of state from both parties technical advice on everything from which vendors to use to how to locate drop boxes. Local officials are the most trusted sources of election information, but few can afford a press secretary, so the Institute distributed communications toolkits. In a presentation to Podortzer's group, McReynolds detailed the importance of absentee ballots for shortening lines at polling places and preventing an election crisis. The Institute's work helped 37 states and D.C. bolster mail voting. But it wouldn't be worth much if people didn't take advantage. Part of the challenge was logistical. Each state has different rules for when and how ballots should be requested and returned. The Voter Participation Center, which in a normal year would have supported local groups deploying canvassers door to door to get out the vote, instead conducted focus groups in April and May to find out what would get people to vote by mail. In August and September, it sent ballot applications to 15 million people in key states, 4.6 million of whom returned them. In mailings and digital ads, the group urged people not to wait for Election Day. Quote, all the work we have done for 17 years was built for this moment of bringing democracy to people's doorsteps, says Tom Lopak, the center's CEO. The effort had to overcome heightened skepticism in some communities. Many black voters preferred to exercise their franchise in person or didn't trust the mail. National civil rights groups worked with local organizations to get the word out that this was the best way to ensure one's vote was counted. In Philadelphia, for example, advocates distributed voting safety kits containing masks, hand sanitizer, and informational brochures. We had to get the message out that this is safe, reliable, and you can trust it, says Hannah Freed of All Voting is Local. At the same time, the Democratic lawyers battled a historic tide of pre-election litigation. The pandemic intensified the party's usual tangling in the courts, but the lawyers noticed something else as well. Quote, the litigation brought by the Trump campaign, of a piece with the broader campaign to sow doubt about mail voting, was making novel claims and using theories no court has ever accepted, said Wendy Weiser, a voting rights expert at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU. They read more like lawsuits designed to send a message rather than achieve a legal outcome. In the end, nearly half the electorate cast ballots by mail in 2020, practically a revolution in how people vote. About a quarter voted early in person. Only a quarter of voters cast their ballots the traditional way, in person on Election Day. The disinformation defense. Bad actors spreading false information is nothing new. For decades, campaigns have grappled with everything from anonymous calls claiming the election has been rescheduled to flyers spreading nasty smears about candidates' families. But Trump's lies and conspiracy theories of the viral force of social media and the involvement of foreign meddlers made disinformation a broader, deeper threat to the 2020 vote. Laura Quinn, a veteran progressive operative who co-founded Catalyst, began studying this problem a few years ago. She piloted a nameless secret project, which she never before publicly discussed, that tracked disinformation online and tried to figure out how to combat it. One component was tracking dangerous lies that might otherwise spread unnoticed. Researchers then provided information to campaigners or the media to track down the sources and expose them. The most important takeaway from Quinn's research, however, was that engaging with toxic content only made it worse. When you get attacked, the instinct is to push back, call it out, say, "This isn't true," Quinn says. But the more engagement something gets, the more platforms boost it. The algorithm reads that as, "Oh, this is popular, people want more of it." Close quote. The solution, she concluded, was to pressure platforms to enforce their rules, both by removing content or accounts that spread disinformation and by more aggressively policing it in the first place. Quote, "The platforms have policies against certain types of malign behavior, but they haven't been enforcing them," she says. Quinn's research gave ammunition to advocates pushing social media platforms to take a harder line. In November 2019, Mark Zuckerberg invited 9 civil rights leaders to dinner at his home, where they warned him about the danger of the election-related falsehoods that were already spreading unchecked. Quote, "It took pushing, urging, conversations, brainstorming, all of that to get to a place where we ended up with more rigorous rules and enforcement," says Vanita Gupta, president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, who attended the dinner and also met with Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey and others. Gupta has been nominated for Associate Attorney General by President Biden. Quote, "It was a struggle, but we got to the point where they understood the problem. Was it enough? Probably not. Was it later than we wanted? Yes. But it was really important, given the level of official disinformation, that they had those rules in place and were tagging things and taking them down. They're just openly telling on themselves." Spreading the word. Beyond battling bad information, there was a need to explain a rapidly changing election process. It was crucial for voters to understand that despite what Trump was saying, mail-in votes weren't susceptible to fraud and that it would be normal if some states weren't finished counting votes on election night. Dick Gephardt, the Democratic former House leader turned high-powered lobbyist, spearheaded one coalition. Quote, "We wanted to get a really bipartisan group of former elected officials, cabinet secretaries, military leaders, and so on, aimed mainly at messaging to the public but also speaking to local officials. The secretaries of state, attorneys general, governors who would be in the eye of the storm, to let them know we wanted to help," says Gephardt, who worked his contacts in the private sector to put $20 million behind the effort. Wamp, the former GOP congressman, worked through the nonpartisan reform group Issue 1 to rally Republicans to the effort. Quote, "We thought we should bring some bipartisan element of unity around what constitutes a free and fair election," Wamp says. The 22 Democrats and 22 Republicans on the National Council on Election Integrity met on Zoom at least once a week. They ran ads in 6 states, made statements, wrote articles, and alerted local officials to potential problems. Quote, "We had rabid Trump supporters who agreed to serve on the council based on the idea that this is honest," Wamp says. "This is going to be just as important," he told them, to convince the liberals when Trump wins. Quote, "Whichever way it cuts, we're going to stick together." The Voting Rights Lab and Into Action created state-specific memes and graphics spread by email, text, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, urging that every vote be counted. Together, they were viewed more than 1 billion times. Protect Democracy's election task force issued reports and held media briefings with high-profile experts across the political spectrum, resulting in widespread coverage of potential election issues and fact-checking of Trump's false claims. The organization's tracking polls found the message was being heard. The percentage of the public that didn't expect to know the winner on election night gradually rose until, by late October, it was over 70%. A majority also believed that a prolonged count wasn't a sign of problems. "We knew exactly what Trump was going to do. He was going to try to use the fact that Democrats voted by mail and Republicans voted in person to make it look like he was ahead, claim victory, say the mail-in votes were fraudulent, and try to get them thrown out," says Protect Democracy's Basson. Setting public expectations ahead of time helped undercut those lies. This is the traitor right here. Yes, Josiah. What else happened in October of 2021? Event 201. Is that, you mean October 19? October of 2019, I think. The Alliance took a common set of themes from the research Shankar Osorio presented at Podortzer's Zooms. Studies have shown that when people don't think their vote will count or fear casting it will be a hassle, they're far less likely to participate. Throughout election season, members of Podorcer's group minimized incidents of voter intimidation and tamped down rising liberal hysteria about Trump's expected refusal to concede. They didn't want to amplify false claims by engaging them or put people off voting by suggesting a rigged game. Quote, when you say these claims of fraud are spurious, what people hear is fraud, Schenker Osorio says. What we saw in our pre-election research was that anything that reaffirmed Trump's power or cast him as an authoritarian diminished people's desire to vote. Podorcer, meanwhile, was warning everyone he knew that polls were underestimating Trump's support. The data he shared with media organizations who would be calling the election was, quote, tremendously useful to understand what was happening as the votes rolled in, according to a member of a major network's political unit who spoke with Podorcer before Election Day. Most analysts had recognized there would be a blue shift in key battlegrounds, the surge of votes breaking toward Democrats driven by tallies of mail-in ballots, but they hadn't comprehended how much better Trump was likely to do on Election Day. Being able to document how big the absentee wave would be and the variance by state was essential, the analyst says. People power. The racial justice uprising sparked by George Floyd's killing in May was not primarily a political movement. The organizers who helped lead it wanted to harness its momentum for the election without allowing it to be co-opted by politicians. They wanted to harness its momentum for the election without allowing it to be co-opted by politicians. So they want to use it for the election, but it's not political. This is the thing Yarvin talks about, the democracy versus politics thing. Politics is bad, democracy is good. What is the difference? The best way to ensure people's voices were heard, they decided, was to protect their ability to vote. Quote, we started thinking about a program that would complement the traditional election protection area, but also didn't rely on calling the police, says Nalini Stamp, the Working Families Party's national organizing director. They created a force of election defenders who, unlike traditional poll watchers, were trained in de-escalation techniques. This is trained in de-escalation techniques. Election defenders. The euphemisms are just next level. During early voting and on Election Day, they surrounded lines of voters in urban areas with a joy to the polls effort that turned the act of casting a ballot into a street party. Black organizers also recruited thousands of poll workers to ensure polling places would stay open in their communities. The summer uprising had shown that people power could have a massive impact. Activists began preparing to reprise the demonstrations if Trump tried to steal the election. So activists began preparing to reprise the demonstrations if Trump tried to steal the election. The summer uprising. So the organized, coordinated mobs burning down streets and attacking people and even in some cases killing people. They were planning to reprise these demonstrations. Quote, Americans plan widespread protests if Trump interferes with election, Reuters reported in October, one of many such stories. More than 150 liberal groups from the Women's March to the Sierra Club to Color of Change, from Democrats.com to the Democratic Socialists of America, joined the Protect the Results Coalition. The group's now defunct website had a map listing 400 planned post-election demonstrations to be activated via text message as soon as November 4. To stop the coup they feared, the left was ready to flood the streets. Strange bedfellows. About a week before Election Day, Podorcer received an unexpected message. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce wanted to talk. The AFL-CIO and the Chamber have a long history of antagonism. Though neither organization is explicitly partisan, the influential business lobby has poured hundreds of millions of dollars into Republican campaigns, just as the nation's unions funnel hundreds of millions to Democrats. On one side is labor, on the other, management, locked in an eternal struggle for power and resources. But behind the scenes, the business community was engaged in its own anxious discussions about how the election and its aftermath might unfold. The summer's racial justice protests had sent a signal to business owners, too. The potential for economy-disrupting civil disorder. With tensions running high, there was a lot of concern about unrest around the election or a breakdown in our normal way we handle contentious elections, says Neil Bradley, the Chamber's executive vice president and chief policy officer. These worries had led the Chamber to release a pre-election statement with the Business Roundtable, a Washington-based CEOs group, as well as associations of manufacturers, wholesalers, and retailers, calling for patience and confidence as votes were counted. But Bradley wanted to send a broader, more bipartisan message. He reached out to Podorcer through an intermediary both men declined to name. Agreeing that their unlikely alliance would be powerful, they began to discuss a joint statement pledging their organization's shared commitment to a fair and peaceful election. They chose their words carefully and scheduled the statement's release for maximum impact. As it was being finalized, Christian leaders signaled their interest in joining, further broadening its reach. The statement was released on Election Day under the names of Chamber CEO Thomas Donahue, AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka, and the heads of the National Association of Evangelicals and the National African American Clergy Network. Quoting, "It is imperative that election officials be given the space and time to count every vote in accordance with applicable laws," it stated. "We call on the media, the candidates, and the American people to exercise patience with the process and trust in our system, even if it requires more time than usual." The groups added, "Although we may not always agree on desired outcomes up and down the ballot, we are united in our call for the American democratic process to proceed without violence, intimidation, or any other tactic that makes us weaker as a nation." Showing up, standing down. Election night began with many Democrats despairing. Trump was running ahead of pre-election polling, winning Florida, Ohio, and Texas easily, and keeping Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania too close to call. But Podolsky was unperturbed when I spoke to him that night. The returns were exactly in line with his modeling. He had been warning for weeks that Trump's voters' turnout was surging. As the numbers dribbled out, he could tell that as long as all the votes were counted, Trump would lose. Indeed. As long as all the votes were counted. Huh. The Liberal Alliance gathered for an 11 p.m. Zoom call. Hundreds joined. Many were freaking out. Quote, "It was really important for me and the team in that moment to help ground people in what we had already known was true," says Angela Peoples, director for the Democracy Defense Coalition. Podolsky presented data to show the group that victory was in hand. Data, huh? While he was talking, Fox News surprised everyone by calling Arizona for Biden. The public awareness campaign had worked. TV anchors were bending over backward to counsel caution and frame the vote count accurately. The question then became what to do next. The conversation that followed was a difficult one, led by the activists charged with the protest strategy. Quote, "We wanted to be mindful of when was the right time to call for moving masses of people into the street," People says. As much as they were eager to mount a show of strength, mobilizing immediately could backfire and put people at risk. Protests that devolved into violent clashes would give Trump a pretext to send in federal agents or troops as he had over the summer. And rather than elevate Trump's complaints by continuing to fight him, the alliance wanted to send the message that the people had spoken. So the word went out. Stand down. Protect the Results announced that it would, quote, "not be activating the entire national mobilization network today, but remains ready to activate if necessary." They're openly acknowledging that all of the riots were all on a leash the entire time. They could be turned on and turned off by instruction. This was, of course, a great grand conspiracy theory, and here they are just openly admitting it. Podolsky credits the activists for their restraint. Quote, "They had spent so much time getting ready to hit the streets on Wednesday, but they did it," he says. "Wednesday through Friday, there was not a single Antifa versus Proud Boys incident like everyone was expecting. And when that didn't materialize, I don't think the Trump campaign had a backup plan." Activists reoriented the Protect the Results protests toward a weekend of celebration. "Counter their disinfo with our confidence and get ready to celebrate," read the messaging guidance Shanker Osorio presented to the Liberal Alliance on Friday, November 6th. "Declare and fortify our win. Vibe. Confident, forward-looking, unified. Not passive, anxious." Huh. What did she say? She said, "Stop fucking blackpilling." The voters, not the candidates, would be the protagonists of the story. The planned day of celebration happened to coincide with the election being called on November 7th. Activists dancing in the streets of Philadelphia blasted Beyoncé over an attempted Trump campaign press conference. The Trumpers' next confab was scheduled for Four Seasons Total Landscaping outside the city center, which activists believe was not a coincidence. "The people of Philadelphia owned the streets of Philadelphia," crows the Working Families Party's Mitchell. "We made them look ridiculous by contrasting our joyous celebration of democracy with their clown show." The votes had been counted. Trump had lost. But the battle wasn't over. The 5 steps to victory. In Podolsky's presentations, winning the vote was only the first step to winning the election. After that came winning the count, winning the certification, winning the Electoral College, and winning the transition. Steps that are normally formalities, but that he knew Trump would see as opportunities for disruption. Nowhere would that be more evident than in Michigan, where Trump's pressure on local Republicans came perilously close to working, and where liberal and conservative pro-democracy forces joined to counter it. It was around 10 p.m. on election night in Detroit when a flurry of texts lit up the phone of Art Reyes III. A busload of Republican election observers had arrived at the TCF Center where votes were being tallied. They were crowding the vote counting tables, refusing to wear masks, heckling the mostly black workers. Reyes, a Flint native who leads We the People Michigan, was expecting this. For months, conservative groups have been sowing suspicion about urban vote fraud. Quote, "The language was, they're going to steal the election. There will be fraud in Detroit," long before any vote was cast, Reyes says. He made his way to the arena and sent word to his network. Within 45 minutes, dozens of reinforcements had arrived. As they entered the arena to provide a counterweight to the GOP observers inside, Reyes took down their cell phone numbers and added them to a massive text chain. Racial justice activists from Detroit Will Breathe worked alongside suburban women from Femmes for Dems and local elected officials. Reyes left at 3 a.m., handing the text chain over to a disability activist. As they mapped out the steps in the election certification process, activists settled on a strategy of foregrounding the people's right to decide, demanding their voices be heard and calling attention to the racial implications of disenfranchising black Detroiters. They flooded the Wayne County Canvassing Board's November 17th certification meeting with on-message testimony. Despite a Trump tweet, the Republican board members certified Detroit's votes. So they literally intimidated them into certifying it. Election boards were one pressure point. Another was GOP-controlled legislatures who Trump believed could declare the election void and appoint their own electors. And so the president invited the GOP leaders of the Michigan legislature, House Speaker Lee Chatfield and Senate Majority Leader Mike Shirkey, to Washington on November 20. It was a perilous moment. If Chatfield and Shirkey agreed to do Trump's bidding, Republicans in other states might be similarly bullied. Quote, "I was concerned things were going to get weird," says Jeff Timmer, a former Michigan GOP executive director turned anti-Trump activist. Norm Eisen describes it as the scariest moment of the entire election. The democracy defenders launched a full-court press. Protect democracy's local context, research the lawmakers' personal and political motives. Issue 1 ran television ads in Lansing. The Chamber's Bradley kept close tabs on the process. Wamp, the former Republican congressman, called his former colleague Mike Rogers, who wrote an op-ed for the Detroit newspapers urging officials to honor the will of the voters. 3 former Michigan governors, Republicans John Engler and Rick Snyder and Democrat Jennifer Granholm, jointly called for Michigan's electoral votes to be cast free of pressure from the White House. Engler, a former head of the Business Roundtable, made phone calls to influential donors and fellow GOP elder statesmen who could press the lawmakers privately. The pro-democracy forces were up against a Trumpified Michigan GOP, controlled by allies of Ronna McDaniel, the Republican National Committee chair, who got promptly kicked out onto her ass, and Betsy DeVos, the former education secretary and a member of a billionaire family of GOP donors. On a call with his team on November 18, Bass invented that his side's pressure was no match for what Trump could offer. Of course he's going to try to offer them something, Basson recalls thinking. Head of the Space Force, ambassador to wherever. We can't compete with that by offering carrots. We need a stick. If Trump were to offer something in exchange for a personal favor, that would likely constitute bribery, Basson reasoned. He phoned Richard Primus, a law professor at the University of Michigan, to see if Primus agreed and would make the argument publicly. Primus said he thought the meeting itself was inappropriate and got to work on an op-ed for Politico, warning that the state attorney general, a Democrat, would have no choice but to investigate. When the piece posted on November 19, the attorney general's communications director tweeted it. Protect Democracy soon got word that the lawmakers planned to bring lawyers to the meeting with Trump the next day. Reyes activists scanned flight schedules and flocked to the airports on both ends of Shirkey's journey to D.C. to underscore that the lawmakers were being scrutinized. Again, literally just intimidation. After the meeting, the pair announced they'd pressed the president to deliver COVID relief for their constituents and informed him they saw no role in the election process. Then they went for a drink at the Trump Hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue. A street artist projected their images onto the outside of the building, along with the words, the world is watching. That left one last step. The state canvassing board, made up of 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. One Republican, a Trumper employed by the DeVos family's political nonprofit, was not expected to vote for certification. The other Republican on the board was a little-known lawyer named Aaron Van Langeveld. He sent no signals about what he planned to do, leaving everyone on edge. When the meeting began, Reyes activists flooded the live stream and filled Twitter with their hashtag #AllEyesOnMe, Michigan. A board accustomed to attendance in the single digits suddenly faced an audience of thousands. In hours of testimony, the activists emphasized their message of respecting voters' wishes and affirming democracy rather than scolding the officials. Van Langeveld quickly signaled he would follow precedent. The vote was 3-0 to certify. The other Republican abstained. After that, the dominoes fell. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and the rest of the states certified their electors. Republican officials in Arizona and Georgia stood up to Trump's bullying, and the Electoral College voted on schedule on December 14. How close we came. There was one last milestone on Podhorzer's mind, January 6th. On the day Congress would meet to tally the electoral count, Trump summoned his supporters to D.C. for a rally. Much to their surprise, the thousands who answered his call were met by virtually no counter-demonstrators. To preserve safety and encourage they couldn't be blamed for any mayhem, the activist left was strenuously discouraging counter-activity, Podolzer texted me the morning of January 6th with a crossed fingers emoji. Trump addressed the crowd that afternoon, peddling the lie that lawmakers or Vice President Mike Pence could reject states' electoral votes. He told them to go to the Capitol and fight like hell. Then he returned to the White House as they sacked the building. As lawmakers fled for their lives and his own supporters were shot and trampled, Trump praised the rioters as very special. It was his final attack on democracy, and once again, it failed. By standing down, the democracy campaigners outfoxed their foes. Quote, "We won by the skin of our teeth, honestly, and that's an important point for folks to sit with," says Democracy Defense Coalition's Peoples. There's an impulse for some to say voters decided and democracy won. But it's a mistake to think that this election cycle was a show of strength for democracy. It shows how vulnerable democracy is. Isn't this a fascinating way to say this? There's an impulse for some to say voters decided and democracy won. But it's a mistake to think that this election cycle was a show of strength for democracy. It shows how vulnerable democracy is. Democracy is so vulnerable that we were able to take it over completely and ensure that it was not that the voters decided and democracy won. The members of the Alliance to Protect the Election have gone their separate ways. The Democracy Defense Coalition has been disbanded, though the fight back table lives on. Protect Democracy and the good government advocates have turned their attention to pressing reforms in Congress. Left-wing activists are pressuring the newly empowered Democrats to remember the voters who put them there, while civil rights groups are on guard against further attacks on voting. Business leaders denounced the January 6th attack, and some say they will no longer donate to lawmakers who refuse to certify Biden's victory. Podolzer and his allies are still holding their Zoom strategy sessions, gauging voters' views and developing new messages. And Trump is in Florida, facing his second impeachment, deprived of the Twitter and Facebook accounts he used to push the nation to its breaking point. As I was reporting this article in November and December, I heard different claims about who should get the credit for thwarting Trump's plot. Liberals argued the role of bottom-up people power shouldn't be overlooked, particularly the contributions of people of color and local grassroots activists. Others stressed the heroism of GOP officials, like Van Langeveld and Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, who stood up to Trump at considerable cost. The truth is that neither likely could have succeeded without the other. It's astounding how close we came, how fragile all this really is, says Timmer, the former Michigan GOP executive director. It's like when Wile E. Coyote runs off the cliff. If you don't look down, you don't fall. Our democracy only survives if we all believe and don't look down. Democracy won in the end. The will of the people prevailed. But it's crazy in retrospect that this is what it took to put on an election in the United States of America. And it says, correction appended February 5. The original version of this story misstated the name of Norm Eisen's organization as the Voter Protection Program, not the Voter Protection Project. The original version of the story also misstated Jeff Timmer's former position with the Michigan Republican Party. He was executive director, not the chairman. So there you have it. They mapped out exactly how they did it. They listed off all the important names, all the important organizations, all the funding, exactly how everything was undertaken. Which means these sorts of things can be traced. They can be sourced and substantiated. If you're catching my drift here. But you'll notice that the thing that allowed all of this to happen ultimately came down to public opinion, or the perception of public opinion. Every single element here was all substantiated by intimidation, by going directly after the decision makers and making the will of the people abundantly known to them. This is what I meant with my thread, where everyone, when the time came to take a stand and decide which direction of history I'm going to move with, every single one of these people had ample reason to decide to take a stand on the side of the election fortifiers. They were able to whip up public sentiment and bring together all these different organizations into a coalition that was massively well-funded to make it happen. So this is what they will have to undertake next time. But the entire political climate has completely changed. Their job is vastly more difficult. Zuckerberg has already signaled that he's not going to be contributing the extra, I think it was $419 million that he put up total. Now, I don't think that they're hurting for money sources if they want it. But this here is exactly why I'm saying stop fucking blackpilling. What ultimately turned the tide at the end of the day was willpower. And they manufactured, intimidated, forced their own willpower to take the day. We still have got, who knows what's going to happen between now and 4 months, 5, 6 months from now. Lots of different things can happen that will completely change the landscape, and I'm sure many of these things will. But at the end of the day, what ultimately turns the tide is not the actual willpower of the country, but the perception of willpower. We have today, as it stands right now at least, we have a whole bunch of platforms that we can use, a whole bunch of voices, a whole bunch of very loud voices, a whole bunch of very wealthy voices who are now pot committed to Trump. And their own stamina and willpower will depend upon them believing that they are representing the interests of the country, which means they need as much loud support as they can possibly get. It needs to be perpetual and sustained and coordinated. No blackpilling. No charting out all the potential paths to failure. But willing the result that we want into reality. This is the pragmatic case for not despairing. The moral case for not despairing should be really obvious. And honestly, if you need the pragmatic case because the moral case isn't compelling to you, then you may not going to make it. But you can always turn it around. You can always recognize why no fucking blackpilling is the watchword of the day. Let me catch some of your comments here real quick, and then I'm going to take off. I've got, so it's 4:15 right now at 6 p.m., so hour and 45 minutes, 6 p.m. Central Time. I will be on the 2-Bit podcast, and so you guys should turn out for that. And then at 8 p.m. tonight, Central Time, we'll be doing the Schizo stream in the King Pill Discord, which you can join by going to kingpill.com. Let's see here. Colin Rosh says, the DeVos and Van Andels own Amway and are the 80th wealthiest family in the world. The DeVos family loaned Eric Prince the money to start Blackwater. Prince's sister is Betsy DeVos. She married in. Josh Ham says, I would also say they had a network, like-minded people who knew each other and could make calls to flex weight. This is something the new right might learn from and start building networks. Correct. This is why these networks are so important in coordinating this messaging. We're seeing more and more of the things we talk about pulled out into the mainstream, whether it's through David Sachs or through Vivek or through Elon. There's a bunch of different vectors now where the things we talk about in our little corner of the internet get pulled out into the mainstream and get represented on the actual in the public conversation. And we can take advantage of that. We can drag these sorts of things into public view and force our narrative upon the world. Kate J says the fact that they were able to pull out the margins and not sweeping numbers to overwhelm Trump at the ballot count tells us we can overcome this, especially in the swing states. Exactly. It was, I mean, at the end of the day, it wound up being 7 million votes, ostensibly the vote count. Not 7 million voters, but 7 million votes was the difference between Trump and Biden. That's a small number. They basically squeaked out just what they needed to get the result that they needed. After all of that, all that investment, all that money, all that coordination, all of that organization, all those thousands and thousands of people involved in the process, that got them that far. And they're starting from so much further below ground now. So do not blackpill. Do not despair. Manifest the reality you want to see. Act as if it's going to happen. Talk past the sale. Like this YouTube stream. Subscribe. Subscribe to the podcast if you're listening to the audio later on. And follow me on Twitter at RealKingPilled. I'll be back in an hour and 45 minutes on the 2-Bit podcast, where we will be discussing. You can hear the dulcet tones of the mustache man of the dissident right. And I will otherwise catch you guys back here for the Astrolabe Monday morning. Go join the King Pill Discord. That's the way you can best support the show. Kingpill.com. And we'll be back for more streams for you guys